like, quickly, can everyone raise their hand real quick? Everybody, yep. You guys are like, this is reverse. What are you doing? So put your hand down if you're a designer. Put your hand down if you're a developer. Okay. Put your hand down if you know HTML and CSS. Okay. Those that have your hands up, what do you guys do? What's your... Just out of curiosity. I'm not no bias. What do you do? Consulting? Okay. Project management? Okay. Project managers, how many of you guys?
I'm just starting Code Academy.
You're starting at Code Academy. What class?
Web development.
Web development. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday?
Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
So you had class this morning?
I did.
Okay. How about you?
I'm working on a documentary, and I'm going to need some interactive stuff to do with.
Cool. Okay. Very nice. Well, I'm going to talk about HTML semantics today. Semantics being the practice of giving our code meaning. Like I said, quickly about me, I work for Groupon. We're just down the road. I'm a user interface engineer, so I do a bit of design, a bit of development, kind of traverse the waters between the design and the engineering team. I teach at Code Academy, which you guys all walked by. We're basically beginner focused. We teach people how to code. So Ruby on Rails, HTML, CSS. We have a user experience design class, things like that. And I also help organize Refresh Chicago. If you guys are from Chicago, we have a meeting on Wednesday night over at the ITA, which would be pretty cool if you guys want to check that out as well. And if anyone has any questions about Groupon or Code Academy, let me know. I have Groupon bottle openers if anyone wants one. And I have plenty of stickers for both Groupon and Code Academy as well. So, cool. So why semantics, right? I get asked this a lot. Because this is something I take passion in. And a lot of people are like, Shay, like, what's it matter, man? Like, semantics, you know, there's not great support for semantics in your code. Generally, programming with semantics in mind can slow you down. And overall, it's a bit opinionated. It's a kind of a opinionated topic of what's right, what's wrong. And I can agree with that, but I also like to believe that I like to give my code more meaning, right? I like to extend the capabilities of just straight HTML. So in that, I like to give my code an ambiguous shared meaning, right? So make that stuff sort of traverse the waters. I like to make my code more accessible so it works on mobile devices, tablets, any computer, what it may be. I like to make it international so that it has different language support and I don't have to really worry about covering different C's and barriers with that. And maybe the biggest part is I like the interoperability behind it. I like that meaning behind the code where computers and machines can actually sort of talk to one another. I can write code that Google can index and get more meaning out of it than we can see from our human eyes. How many people have done like a Google search for like a movie time? Yeah? And Google automatically like picks it up and just displays it right there in the search results and says, hey, you know what? The AMC 5 miles away is actually showing that movie at 7:10, 8:45 and that. And you don't even have to click on a website to see that, right? Google's using semantics to sort of figure out that stuff from a website and show it to you. That's that interoperability coming into play saying, hey, you know what? We can get you this information quicker and by the means of what device you're browsing the internet on. And that's sort of what I can geek out on a little bit. So part of semantics, and we'll go through each one of these individually, but structure, right? Like building your page and structure around that. It used to be that we would just use divs, these division tags to mark up everything on our website. HTML5 sort of breaks that barrier down a little bit. Divs don't have any meaning, so when you're using them, users don't get any benefit out of that. Computers don't really understand why you would use a div over anything else. Now we have these structural tags. We have the header, nav, article, section, aside, and footer. And you can kind of see what these mean by reading the slide here. But in general, your header and footer are like the capstones of your pages or your certain sections of a page. Your navigation is sort of saying, hey, like this is a set of navigational links on a page. Article and section were like the hardest for me to grasp. I was like, what's the difference between those two? Does anyone have any idea? Yeah?
I think section is kind of like the student in the art, or the section is the classroom, article is the student in the classroom, like section sets the standard of the area, and article is a subset of that content.
Yeah, it could be. What he's saying is an article could essentially be the parent of the section. Does that make sense?
I was saying the other way around, but you're probably more
Oh.
right than that.
Okay, well, so we're both right. It can actually work either way. We can put articles inside a section, or we can put sections inside an article. The primary difference between the two would be an article should be reserved for things that can be syndicated, right? So think of like a blog, a news story. Anyone have like an RSS feed they subscribe to regularly? Yeah? And when you read that RSS feed, you're not seeing the entire website, right? You're not seeing the navigation or the copyright or any of those related blog posts to it on that RSS feed. That's something that's syndicated, pulled away from the site it's on, and repurposed for you to see. That stuff belongs in an article. It's things that you can reuse without losing a visitor, right? They can read what's inside that article and not be lost and out of context with what else is on the page. A section is not that. A section is saying, hey, this is a thematic section of content here. This all belongs together, but outside of the scope of this document, it might not make sense. Okay? It's a way of sort of distributing the difference between those two. And aside then is essentially saying, hey, this is relative information tied to that section, that article, or whatever parent we're sort of talking about here, but it's not directly related to it. It's just tangentially tied to it. And then the footer being the closing content. So this looks a bit like this. Those that are close and familiar with code, we'll look at quite a bit of code today. But you can see here we have like the body of the page, and we have the header, and we have the nav inside the header, and we have an article with a section inside it, and so forth. This is sort of moving away from divs, giving our content a better outline so that users and things like that can sort of pick up on this and know exactly what we're talking about. We can also expand these then, using these Aria roles. And what these are sort of saying is, these are the roles, the recommendations based on what's inside that content. And these are strictly recommendations. The header isn't always going to have a role of banner per se, right? The content inside that element really derives what that role should be, okay? And in these, that banner on the header and then the content info role on the footer are pretty strict. Like they can only be used once per page, okay? Where a header and a footer we can reuse a couple times on a page, right? Our article can have a header and a footer per se. But we can't reuse those roles inside of that, okay? So text. Now that we know how to basically structure the page, looking at text in general, there's a couple different ways we can bold text, for example. And each way you bold text actually has a little bit of a different meaning. Simply to set your text as stylistically offset, you can just use the bold element, this B that we see here. But if we want to give that text a little more emphasis and make that more important to a user, we can use the strong element here. And that's basically saying, hey, we want to place strong emphasis on this text inside here. We can do the same thing with italicizing text. An I just means you're basically using an alternate voice or tone, okay? But the EM is saying, hey, this is actually stressed emphasis. This is something we really want to drive to the user. We want them to be richer. And that has more weight, more importance than the actual I element. How it looks, its appearance is still going to be the same. They're going to look identical to the user. But for a phone or a Google or somebody to scrape this page and look at it, it's going to give more weight to that EM in this case. So underlining text. There's a couple different ways we can do this. The U is basically an unarticulated annotation. So that could be a spelling, an error, or something in a different language that doesn't quite make sense, that you're not directly familiar with. The ends element here is supposed to highlight text that has basically been added to a page recently. Okay? So think of if you're reading an article, and then the editor comes back when they have more information and adds text to that. Sometimes you see like an editor's note tied to that. That text should go inside this ends here. Okay? And we use this cite attribute to basically provide a reference to say, hey, this is why this document was changed, right? So that could link to another web page that says, hey, you know what, here's an update on this story. Okay, and that's providing a value to those users basically scanning that page. And we have this datetime attribute to say exactly when was this edit made, right? It's a way of sort of tracking the history of this document. And we can do the same thing with striking text. So striking, just putting in basically a line through it, we can use this S element. That's saying, hey, this text no longer really accurate or relevant to this page. But the del element, this delete here, is saying this is actually text that's been deleted from the document. Okay? And same thing here. We link off to maybe it's meeting minutes or We have like a ticketing system where we have people submit tickets about bugs in a software system and say, hey, you know, we actually changed some of the code or we deleted some of this draft based on this. And that's where that site attribute actually points to. Then the date time here, again, links to say, hey, when was this change occurred? You know, when was this text actually deleted from the document? So navigation and action items here then. We have two elements we can use here. We have this nav and we have this menu. And when I saw both of these, I was like, that does not make sense at all. Like, it's the same thing, nav and menu, right? And I had to dig a little deeper. And nav, as I came to find, was essentially links to other page. This is a navigational set of cues here. You're either going to another website, you're going somewhere else on the same website, but you're always moving. You're transactioning in one direction or another. A menu was more controls. We're primarily based around applications you're working with, right? So you're creating a new document, you're saving one, you're closing it. Things of that nature. Those are controls. And those should go within the menu element then. Hyperlinks then, linking to another page. It used to be that this was a strictly inline level element, meaning we'd basically have to reuse this anchor around every time we wanted to repurpose a link on a page, okay? So imagine I have an article and I want the picture to be a link, I want the heading to be a link, and then I have like a read more link or continue reading. Essentially, I had to create 3 anchor tags in my code to say, hey, go look at this, go look at this, go look at this. And it was really repetitive and it would bloat your code. That's no longer the case. We can use these anchors as a block level element and sort of wrap code inside of that. So now I have, in this case, I have my heading that's a link and my paragraph are a link. And I can tie those behaviors together. I can make those unison so that when you hover over that entire section, those controls change at the same time, right? So if I want to change the text color or I want to change the color of a border around an image, those two changes can happen at the same time. Where before they were independent of one another. I'd hover over the text, it would color, or it would change its color, and then I'd hover over the image and the border would change. It would be two different behaviors, but they do the same thing. It was a bit disconnected, and we wrote a lot of code to do that. We don't have to do that anymore. I find this really neat. We have this hyperlink Boolean attribute of download. And what this says to users and browsers is saying, hey, you know what? I'm linking to a file here. So rather than take the browser and navigate to that file, right? Like how many people have clicked on like a PDF document, it just opens within the browser. And you're like, well, hold on, I actually wanted to save that because I need to print it or I need to reference it at a later date. We can use this download attribute and say, hey, you know what? Actually prompt a queue to say, hey, we need to download this. This is a file we actually want the user to save to their hard drive. And we can do that by just saying download right on the anchor element itself. We can give it a value. In that second example, we have company logo. And that's what that file will save as then. So rather than having logo.png saved on the hard drive, it will actually save as company-logo.png. And this is kind of beneficial if you're working with like a CDN. You have a content delivery network and you're putting like headers on top of these images. And what that does, we'll create like a file name like logo.png !00460081 or something, and that saves on your computer. You're like, what is that? Right? Like, I don't get it. I don't know what that is. So you can give that an explicit name and sort of better define that. We can use this real attribute, and this sort of is used to determine the behavior, that relationship between the link and the page you're going to, right? So the page you're on, you're linking to another page. What's the behavior? What's that relationship between the two? Okay, so a lot of times you're linking to like a terms of use, a privacy policy or something like that. You can use a copyright attribute inside this reel. A lot of times you're reading like a book online, so to speak, and you might have to go from next to previous chapters or something like that. You can define that relationship between those two pages with the real attribute here. And machines pick this up. Computers will pick this up and say, hey, you know what? Like subsequently, this is the next page you're supposed to go to, and they can flow you through a document. This happens a lot in books, right? You can have an index page that lists all the chapters. You can have a glossary tied to that, and then you can do next and previous between the pages and the chapters themselves. Highlighting text on a page. It used to be that we would just use a span here, and span was essentially meaningless. There was no really value to a span. But say we just wanted to highlight text on a page for reference purposes. It's where this mark element comes in. Essentially, just think of that as like a highlighter, just highlighting text on a page. There's a couple different instances where you might find this useful. Where I found it the most useful was within search results, right? So if you're searching for the word Chicago, maybe in all those search engine result listings, you actually want to highlight the word Chicago so that you as a user can sort of parse those and scan down that list quickly. And it's pretty helpful for references. I've used it in other places, but this is generally the most common place I've seen it. So gauging scale, movie reviews, book reviews, things like that. We can use this meter element to tell computers and users, hey, this is a fixed measure here, right? So say I review a restaurant, I can give it a rating. Think of like IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, different services like that, Yelp, can use this meter element. And as a user, you can basically parse and search for restaurants based on their rating, right? And we can find that rating because it's marked up within this meter element. We don't have to really hunt for it. The code is explicitly stating, hey, you know what, this is already measured. We got this, and we can hand this to you very easily and readily. On the opposite side of this is progress then. And progress is something that's changing, right? It's not a fixed measure. This is something that's continuing. We're expecting this to grow. Okay, so think of like a checkout process. I'm on Amazon and I'm buying a book. I'm buying Chad's book, okay, when it's available in like a week or two, right? And there's different steps to that process, right? So step 0 is essentially I'm in the cart. Step 1 is hitting checkout. They're probably going to ask for like my shipping information or my billing information. Step 2 might be my actual credit card information then. Okay, step 4 is an actual confirmation. We can use this progress element to work our way through that. Okay, and we have these min and max values to it, and how we can sort of tie these together, so we can gauge that progress. And you can explicitly just state 50%. We're halfway through this, or if you don't want to, you can actually work your way through it. So in this case, say hold tight, you're getting there, right? We don't actually put a value in there. But we use these attributes, these min, max, and value attributes to actually work our way through this code so that users and browsers sort of know what this means. Time. Time is all over the internet, like just timestamps of everything. Now we have a more semantic way of actually saying this is what we're looking at, right? It used to be that this would just be in like a strong tag or a paragraph. There's no explicit way to say, hey, this is actually like time. And that was a pretty big issue. So now we have this time element. And we use this datetime attribute to sort of provide a more semantic timestamp here that we can sort of universalize and use across all systems. And how this looks is year, month, date, T, then hours, minutes, and seconds. And you can sort of see it if you're just dealing with the time, like in the first example, 3 o'clock is 1500. And so forth. You can work your way down. The very last example doesn't have a datetime attribute because it's actually already in that format that we're looking for. So we don't have to repeat that. Browsers will pick that up and they can sort of parse that automatically. They don't need that reinforcement, so to speak. You notice on the second to last example, we have this Boolean attribute of pub date. Okay? That's for when an article or something was published, right? So if you have a blog and you publish that, you can put that pub date article. And that way when someone's searching for news, we can filter that by like the most recent news per se. We're not looking at stories that were a year old. We can basically parse that pub date and say, hey, you know what, let's just serve up the most recent and relative information for this time. So we can hide content. Who's ever used set the style of an element to display none to hide it? Those that were programmers in the room. Yeah? Have you ever thought about just using the hidden Boolean element instead, or attribute, excuse me? No? It's interesting, like no one really thinks about this, and it kind of blows me away. The hidden attribute, it's a global attribute. We can use that on any element on a page, and it'll hide it, okay? And screen readers and things like that will semantically skip it, right? So think of a blind user coming to a page to fill out a contact form. And we have a success message on that page. But we're using the style of display none to not show it to the user, right? But that blind person can't see it. So when the screen reader is reading this page and parsing down it, it's going to say, contact us. Thank you. We'll get back to you soon. And they're going to be like, what? And then it's going to ask for their name and email and message. And they're going to be like, I'm so confused. I didn't fill anything out, but you said thank you. That's because the style is set to none. So we can't see it, but it would be read to us. Okay? If we use the hidden attribute here, that screen reader would skip it. In the same way we would use JavaScript to turn on the style and set that to block or inline or what have it, we can also set hidden to be turned on and added. And then that would reappear to those blind users, and the screen reader would pick that up and read it to them then, after they actually committed that form. Something to think about. I know a lot of people don't do it. And some screen readers are smart enough to pick up on display none and not read it, but not all of them. Like Jaws is pretty good. Jaws will skip it. But not every screen reader does. And I've watched I don't want to say user testing because I hate that word. Like just testing in general, where like blind users are like, I didn't do anything, or I haven't bought this yet. Why are you saying like I'm confirmed? Like they get very confused and it throws them off their game a minute. And this is a much easy way to get around that. It's not difficult to do. So pseudo selectors then as well. And we can use these in our CSS. Rather than sort of putting extra elements in our code and using spans all over the place, we can use these CSS selectors. So in this case, if we want to make that H really large, we have an option to basically put that in a span and set a style on that span. Or we can use this first letter selector here. And you can do the same thing. There's like a first line selector where it would select the entire first line. There's a handful of these different selectors. Look into these and see where you can use these in place of extra code. Same thing with this, this attribute element here. I'm using an ampersand to basically put this little fancy and sign in here, right? And I could put a span on that and just give that a class of and or something like that. But semantically, that's not saying anything. That's not, doesn't have any weight or meaning to it, okay? I can use the attribute element and give it an actual title of and, of what's actually being shown on the page, and it has much more weight, much more content and value to that for users. And this is the case where I actually have to put an element on the page. It's about choosing that right element to put there. So list. Do you guys use ordered list a lot? Yeah? All right, this might blow your mind. Maybe not. You guys are like, no. We have this start attribute we can put on our ordered list to say, hey, you know what? Actually, rather than starting at 1, I want to start at 30. Because I already did 1 through 29 on the page before. And you can give this a start attribute here. And you can see here, I just put the value of what will actually be shown here inside that list item. So this would start at 30 and then go 31, 32, so forth. We can do that, but then we can also change it. I'm going to use my laser. We can put a value on that list item and set it to 40. And then the following one after that will automatically inherit to 41 and work its way back down, right? And this becomes useful if you're starting to nest lists too, right? So say 31 is there, but 31.1 or 32, so to speak, might be a layer or level deeper. You can bump users down and then reset the value using that value attribute. We can reverse a list too. I was blown away when I could do this. I always want to do like a reverse list, right? And semantically, I couldn't do that. I'd use an ordered list, but then I would essentially break it and put my own numbers in and not use like the defaults. But now we can count backwards, which is pretty nice. And this still works with that value attribute too, right? So in the middle of a list, I could change that value to 30, and everything before that, or excuse me, after that, so to speak, would lead up to that, which is pretty nice. Who's done much with like HTML5 audio, video stuff? A little bit? Cool. So I think we all know that there's like a bit of a struggle to get video to work on mobile devices. HTML5 is sort of out to resolve that problem, so to speak, and standardize how videos and audio clips should be handled online. This is a bit what it looks like for video. We have a video element. We can give it a source, and then we should give it a height and a width to predetermine how that should be parsed on a page. Looks a bit like this. We can take it a step further and give it some different attributes. We can give it a poster. We can give it a preload attribute. We have autoplay, controls, loop, and muted. I think autoplay, controls, loop, and muted sort of make sense. Those are kind of self-explanatory. And those are Boolean elements. So those are either on or off. So I could set autoplay equal to off or false. That clip will still play automatically. What's kind of interesting is poster. YouTube videos by default allow you to basically set an image that sits inside that frame before that video is played. That's what the poster attribute does. You can specify an image to say, hey, this is what I want to be shown on my video frame until a user actually clicks play. Then I want the video to actually load in place of that. This is pretty nice. Preload is also interesting in the fact that we can set it to like auto, none, or metadata, right? And what that does is auto by default will sort of preload about the first 30% of the clip. And it'll also preload like the artist, the length of it and things like that so that a user can see that stuff, but it doesn't waste all your bandwidth in actually loading the entire clip, okay? None will simply not load any of it, right? So if you don't think a user is actually going to play that video, you can set it to none and not preload any of it and save your bandwidth, right? And actually let the other page around that video load quicker. Metadata just loads sort of like the clip length, the title of it, and things like that as well. So fallbacks for a video. This is where it gets a little tricky. Every browser has sort of said, hey, you know what, we're going to support this differently. We're not going to make this easy on you guys because they wouldn't want to do that. But what we have here is we have different sources we can specify inside the video element. Okay? So before where we put a source on that video element, we're actually putting sources inside of it now. And what these do is they work from top to bottom. So browser's going to try and pick up that first one, and if it doesn't recognize it, it's going to move to the second, then to the third, and all the way down. And what I've done here, and what's sort of recommended, is give the browser a fallback. So say it doesn't support this video element at all. Say we're using like IE6 or an older version of a browser. We can just give it a Flash player, how primarily videos are handled online, and say, hey, you know what, just go ahead and play this video in Flash. And for those browsers that really don't like us, that don't support the video or Flash, we can let a user download it. We can just go ahead and say, you know what, download this movie, here's some links to it, okay? So long as we legally have the context to do that, we're allowed to. I also like to include an image here. So if I'm using a poster attribute, I also like to put that on a page for users that can't see it, right? If I already have that image, I might as well get some life out of it. For those users that actually don't support the video element, we can still show them that image and give them some download choices. We can take this a bit further too and give it tracks. And tracks can be tied back to that video. So we can give it subtitles and captions and things like that. So for users in different countries, we can give it different languages of subtitles and captions. And it looks a bit like this. So we have all our sources at the top. And below that, we can specify our tracks, and we can give it a kind, right? So is this a caption? Is this a subtitle? And so forth. And we can set a label. And what that label is what's basically shown to the user, right? So we can say these are English captions or English subtitles, okay? And then we can give it, a source language to say, hey, you know what, this is English, this is French, so forth. And we can use this default Boolean attribute here. It says, hey, like this is the default caption I want to load. And let the user change it if they wish, okay? Audio. Audio works a lot like video does. And I'll sort of skim through this a little bit. And it's going to look relatively familiar. Again, we have the audio element. We can put a source in there, and we can use these autoplay, controls, loop, and preload attributes again. We can't use the poster one here. This doesn't actually work with audio. And the first time I did audio, I didn't include the controls attribute. And I was like, where's my audio clip? Because it doesn't actually show on the page unless we use that controls attribute. right? So if you want something to play in the background or something like that, you might set the autoplay attribute on and leave controls off so that the clip plays, but a user doesn't actually see it. I don't recommend that because you might annoy your users, but that's how that would be accomplished. Okay, I shouldn't have told you. So fallbacks works the same way then too. Again, we can use the audio element and put our sources inside that. And you see I put the controls attribute on that audio element because I actually want to show that player to the user then. These sources then specify which source a browser can sort of select from to play. And again, defaulting all the way back, giving them download options should a browser not support those. Iframes. Who uses iframes? You guys all have like grins on your faces like, yeah, I use them. Why do you guys hate them? Domain? Okay. So we can fix that. The first thing about iframes, and this is sort of like that display none thing, no one ever gives iframes a fallback, like when a browser doesn't support iframes. I'm like, well, an iframe has an opening and a closing tag for a reason. Like, why is that? And most developers are like, I don't know. Never thought about it. And it's kind of interesting because sometimes we put like legal text inside an iframe, right? Like say you're agreeing to a terms or a policy. A lot of times they like throw an iframe on there and they make the font like super small. And you got to scroll through it and then check box that you actually agree to these terms and then submit that form. I'm like, what if the person doesn't support iframes and how can they agree to that? Like they can't see that. So legally, how can they agree to it? This is where a fallback comes into play. We can put a link inside this iframe. Though if that iframe is not actually shown on the page, a user can still actually click this link and go read those policies, then agree to them, right? That's legal. Not giving them a fallback is kind of ugly, right? It's a rare case that iframes aren't supported, but there is that one case. Maybe a user is really suspicious and they turn that stuff off, right? They turn that off on their browser. You say cross-domain problems. We have the sandbox attribute that can sort of is out to solve these, right? People get very malicious with iframes. They try and hack into your site. We can stop them. The sandbox attribute is basically saying, I want this iframe to appear on my page, but I want to actually turn off form submissions, right? I don't want JavaScript to run. I don't want them to be able to load any external links into Target. I don't want them throwing pop-ups. And I don't want them having local access to my machine, my hard drive, my computer at all, right? Or my server. It also turns off any and all plugins tied to it, okay? And what this looks like are these values here. We can allow forms, we can allow scripts, we can allow the same origin. So we can allow those links to sort of pop up in the browser and play just as if they would on our site. And we can allow that top level of navigation too. In code, it looks a little like this. As a Boolean attribute by default, we turn all that stuff off. We're like, you know what, you're not allowed to do any of this. No JavaScript, no forms, no local access, none of that. You can't do it, okay? We can give it one value and say sandbox, allow forms. So what it does is it turns off JavaScript and all that local access and plugins and everything, but actually allows you to submit forms from that iframe, okay? We can give it more than one value. We can say allow scripts, allow same origin, allow forms if we want. We can turn on these individual properties if we wish, or we could leave them off. The one we can't turn on, though, however, is plugins. We can't allow plugins. Does anyone have any idea why? We can't allow plugins because plugins could essentially override any other value we try and put in here, right? So say, hey, we don't want you to allow you to run JavaScript, but go ahead and run plugins. That plugin can essentially say, nope, go ahead and allow JavaScript. It sort of defeats the purpose of the attribute altogether, okay? We can expand these iframes with the seamless attribute then too. And this is kind of interesting. What seamless does is say, treat this iframe as if it were like my own, right? Like as if this was just always part of our page, okay? And what this does is any links that are inside that iframe, just go ahead and open up in that page itself, okay? That iframe will inherit the same CSS and JavaScript that the page it's on actually includes. That's crazy. It's never been done before. It kind of blows my mind. And screen readers will read this content in line. Okay, so if it's coming down a page, the screen reader won't skip it and keep moving down the page. It'll actually just read that stuff in line like it was already on the page. Okay? This is kind of interesting. You know, if we have like reviews on our site or we have comments or something, right? And Google's seeing that content. Someone could be leaving comments on my blog that are super disruptive, totally not my views, my opinions at all, very malicious. Google might be like, I don't know, man, it's on your site. Seems like it's yours. You own it. I can put those inside an iframe and say, you know what, like, treat these if they are on my site, but not directly tied to me, right? We can sort of provide a layer of separation there. We have forms, and forms got a major lift in HTML5. Has anyone been using the HTML5 forms at all? Yeah? You are, I know you are. We have all these new input types, okay? And it used to be we just had input type of text, and we have this plain text field on a page. We have tons of new ones. One of those being color. Currently, the support for these isn't crazy. Opera is on the ball. They support this stuff. And this is what color would look like inside Opera right now. Basically gives you this palette choice of different options. Think of your WYSIWYG editor, right? You know, you're typing an email and you want to change the color of text here. We use a color input to do that. And when I saw this at first, I was like, that does not seem very practical. It's like, I've never changed color on anything. And then I went to buy a new car, and I was like, I want to filter by color. I was like, okay. It has its purposes, and you find those. Date and time. We have that time attribute, or excuse me, element, right? And then we have the date time attribute. Those are also now inputs, okay? And what that looks like is a bit like this. Instead of input type of text, we can do input type of date time local, month, time, week. And it gives us this calendar in the browser like this. On phones, it actually prompts up. So on an iPhone, you get those little dials, right, where we can select a month, date, and year. We sort of like to have the spinners. And that's a huge usability play for users, right? That's so easy to do. There's no extra scripting involved to get that moving. And we can validate against that stuff too, which I'll talk about in a minute. Email. We can do an input type of email. And for iOS, essentially you get this @ and a dot inside your keyboard, so you're not having to flash between two different sets of keyboards to go find that .com or anything. Those are right there for you. Okay? And we can use this multiple Boolean attribute here to sort of say, hey, we want to provide multiple emails. We can comma separate those, just as if we were typing an email to multiple recipients. We have number, input type of number. And we get these little spinners on the side where we can dial up a number up and down. And we can give it a minimum and a maximum value. And we can set those to decimals if we wanted to do decimal points. Does anyone know why we don't see the number pad here? Like the actual 0 through 9? I'll let you know in a minute. One reason is for decimals, right? You see we have this decimal point and commas. We might want those values. We have a range, input type of range, and this gives us a slider, right? Has anyone booked a flight where they're like, how flexible are your travel days? Maybe you're flexible by a day or two, and you can sort of set this slider to set that. Or you leave a review from 0 to 10. You can set a slider value to pick that out. Here's your number pad. Input type of for telephone. Okay? When I saw this, I was like, okay, yeah, makes sense. I got it. Search. Same type of thing. Input type of search. We get this search button. It's not go or submit or any of that. It actually says search. In browsers, I believe WebKit is doing this. Your input type actually has rounded corners on it. And as you start typing, there's an X on that right-hand side. And if you hit that X, it clears your form input for you. Okay? I don't know how many people use Safari as like their default browser. That search box in Safari is essentially how they're treating the search input field on a web page as well. We have input type of URL. And this sort of assumes the HTTP for you. So I could just put in shay.com if I wanted. And as you see here, I get the dot, a /, a .com. Again, you're providing value behind these meanings of these inputs, and you're also providing a bit more accessibility to users using these as well. This one I thought was pretty neat, the data list. This is a huge accessibility win. Essentially, we can give our input type a list and give it, for this example, cities. We have a data list of cities as well. And we can give it different options. So as you start typing, we can ask a user what they want to see here. This is awesome. We can do a bit of automation here. We can use this autocomplete off to basically say, hey, don't let the browser fill this form out for me. I'm asking for very secure, sensitive information here, credit card information, things tied to that. We can sort of set that to off if we want. We have autofocus too, where if a page loads, we want to put that focus in one of those input forms to start with. We can use this autofocus Boolean attribute here as well. We can provide a bit more assistance. We have this placeholder value. You guys have seen the forms where it says like, please start typing here, and then when you click in it, it goes away, and you can type in whatever value you want. You used to be able to use JavaScript to do this. Now we can use this placeholder attribute. So in this case, we have Chicago in there, and if I clicked in there, Chicago would go away, and I could type in whatever city I wanted, so to speak. I like to put title attributes on my inputs. That way when you hover over it, it gives you like a bit of a tooltip, right? So please enter your destination, so to speak here. Again, it's just providing a bit more help for users. Disabling inputs, if we want to turn them off. We can use this Boolean attribute to disable it, and that would turn off an individual input. We could also put disabled on a field set to turn off a group of inputs too. If your input type is hidden, this disabled attribute is actually ignored. And this works on option groups as well for like drop-down menus. But again, this isn't allowing users to submit that information, and it's also telling Google and other machines like, hey, like actually, these aren't good. Like we don't want this information right now. We can ask for steps. So in our numbers, right? If we're going from 10 to 100, we can set a step of 2, meaning it goes from 10 to 12 to 14, 16, and works its way up. We can set that step as a decimal and make it increments in halves if we want. What's kind of interesting here is if we're using a date, we can use min, max, and step to say, hey, I'm only looking at things between May 1st and the end of August. And I actually only want a user to be able to select between every other day, because that's when I'm running little boat cruises on the lake or something. It's a way to basically validate your input and work against that. On that note, validation. We can use this required Boolean attribute to say, hey, actually you have to fill this out. You can't submit the form until you fill this out. And we can give it a pattern here too. On phone, for example, tell. We don't necessarily know where a user's at and what their phone number might look like. So we can use this pattern, and this pattern's a regular expression, and that's a bit sad, because I don't like regular expressions. They're just a pain. They're not fun. Anyone who's used them, I think, might agree with me. And we can also set a max length to say, hey, you know what? Like if you have a website, chances are it's not longer than 100 characters, so to speak. And we can sort of force people into that type of stuff too. This primarily works on like phone numbers and things like that, zip codes, things like that. You want to box them into a certain length. Our validation, we can then use CSS to sort of stylize against this, right? So if we say input required, we can set a star in there. Say, hey, you know what? Like you actually have to fill this out. And then when a user does, required will also trigger like a valid attribute. And we can say, cool, we got it. You're good. Cool? And we're not having to use like extra elements to sort of tie into this. We can do this all in the browser. So the last thing I'll say is get involved, right? Like semantics are a work in progress. They can be daunting. There's a lot to them. But it's young in the game. And HTML5 is still growing very quickly. And the quicker we can advocate them, the more good work we can do and the better we can help each other. Cool? Any questions? Yeah.
If I was a non-developer, if I wanted to learn a language just for the understanding the elegance of how a language works, what would you suggest as a basic language for non-developers to learn?
Well, I guess I would want to know what your goal was, like what sort of problem you were trying to solve out of that. Like, do you actually want to write in a language, or are you just looking to learn one?
I guess have a general sense of what it is. So when I see it, I can conceptually understand what you're trying to tell me.
Yeah.
I don't understand the elegance of it, or the specifics.
Okay, cool. Maybe this is selfish for me. I would recommend you learn HTML and CSS. And I say that because that's what the internet's built out of, right? So no matter what backend you're using, whether it's PHP or Ruby on Rails or Python or anything, your front end's still going to be in HTML and CSS. That's what your pages are going to be made of. I teach it at Code Academy. You can go to learn.shayhowe.com, and you can sort of see what I teach. I have a guide that I wrote that I just share with everyone. I say, hey, this is how we basically build web pages. That's where I would start. And you can shoot me an email. You can hit me up on Twitter, and I'm happy to help you guys too learn this stuff. So.
Is HTML5 or just HTML?
So yeah. So here's the thing: is it's not me in general. A lot of people want to get away from versioning this, right? If we keep putting numbers to this, it doesn't allow it to grow very quickly, right? Think of Apple, how they started to get rid of version numbers on phones and things like that, right? That's what we want to do with HTML. So we want HTML to be like this living, breathing document and spec. We don't want it to be set in versions where every 10 years we have to go into a new spec. We just want it to be grow all at once. So this guide basically covers everything: HTML5, HTML4, 3, 2, basically all of it. Yeah.
Do you, I know that a lot of this stuff is only available like WebKit, mobile, you don't use HTML5. Do you use a certain shift for when you try to
Yeah.
for commercial or?
Absolutely. So I use Modernizer. Yeah, are you familiar with it? Yep. So he's saying, what do I do for browsers that don't support this stuff? I use Modernizer. Modernizer is a JavaScript library or plugin that essentially does feature detection, not browser detection. So rather than saying, hey, is your browser IE6? It's saying, no. Does your browser support this input type? And if it doesn't, treat it this way. So for those input types of dates, for example, I'll let a browser decide if it supports it, cool, use the browser default. If it doesn't, Modernizer will throw a flag and then let me write a JavaScript parser to say, hey, actually I want to build in a calendar for users to use here. Cool? Awesome. I'll say one last thing is, I'll be at the UX Mad conference in Madison. If anyone is curious about going, you can save $50 with coupon code Shay Howe. That's my promotion.
All right, great.
And I have Groupon bottle openers. So if you guys want one, come let me know. And we're hiring too. So, thank you.
What more could you ask for? Thanks, Shay.